Hey media. Recently, we've been talking about different forms of bias that we can find in print news. But now I also want us to think about television news. When I send you off on your own to find your own news stories, many of you will have that print article, but additionally, you may have a video, and the video will work a little bit differently in terms of bias. Some of the types of bias that we've already studied show up in very similar ways on television news. Bias by headline, we know, comes at the top of a news story, and a lot of people are very lazy and maybe will only read the headline. Sometimes when I'm scrolling through my news app, I may only read the headline. And on TV news, you can see I have a still from a TV news station here. That banner across the bottom serves as the headline. So maybe I'm even watching the news on mute, so all I can see is that headline. That is very similar to only reading the headlines when I'm scrolling through on social media or if I'm scrolling through a news app. If that headline has bias, well, then I might have bias towards the entire story. The rest of these types of bias work very similarly, just in terms of how they're delivered is different. So instead of reading the statistic or reading the word choice or tone or the names or titles, it's verbal because we have reporters and anchors who are verbally telling us and showing us the news. So just like in print, someone may be called Mr., or they may be called Ms., or they may be called secretary or president or given whatever their proper title is, or they might be given an unofficial title that could denigrate or bring them up either way. That can happen on television news as well. Let's look at the types of bias that work a little bit differently. One is bias by selection and omission. Now, in a print article, they could just be missing some information and maybe it's coincidence or maybe they chose to take that out. Well, the same can be said on television news. You'll want to think about an entire hour of a news broadcast covers maybe 10 stories of the day and what's been happening. And maybe a news station chooses not to show a certain story or not to cover a certain story. Well, that would certainly be bias by omission. Similarly, bias by placement, the news station could include the story, but maybe they place it towards the end of the news broadcast when they know people are likely to tune out. We know that people have short attention spans, and so the beginning is often what they pay attention to, and at the end, they're more likely to tune out. So, the same thing when you're reading a news article on your phone, you probably read the first paragraph, and then at least I scroll, and I just skim the rest of it. And often people do that when they're watching the news as well. They're more likely to watch the beginning of a video or the beginning of a news clip and less likely to watch the end. Finally, bias by source control works a little bit differently as well in terms of who is interviewed. When we have a scenario that's playing out, we often, to get the best report we can, the least biased report we can, will want to get viewpoints that span the spectrum of what's going on. So in a written report, you might see quotes from certain people. In a live news report, you might see interviews of certain people. And you'll want to keep in mind if the reporter or the anchor interviewed people surrounding the situation or if they're missing some viewpoint or some perspective. I gave the example of a school event. We might think about who would be interviewed in a school event. And if I'm an anchor on TV or a reporter and I'm interviewing people, I would probably want to interview the school principal. I would probably want to interview a teacher or a student, but maybe also a community member. So think about all the people who would be connected to that situation. And if we're missing one of those viewpoints, that might be biased by source control. So even though some of these forms of bias look very similar, they're just spoken instead of written, some of them look a little bit different in terms of omission, placement, and source control. So when you go out and find your own news sources, of course, you'll be reading the text that's written, but you may also have some videos or some graphics that we haven't studied as much. And I want you to keep these types of bias in mind as you go off on your own to read and watch the news.